Home Rule Crisis. Parties achieving their political objectives up to September 1914. Intro. Explain the state of Home Rule by September 1914. Home Rule was placed on the statute book, but was suspended until the end of the war with a promised amendment for Ulster. Liberals. Home Rule was not a priority for Liberals, but with the House of Lords opposition nullified, many felt it was their duty to fulfil the traditional support for Home Rule that had begun with Gladstone. However, by 1914, the Liberals were terminally damaged by the crisis that had come previously close to civil war. The war arguably saved Asquith's government from their indecisiveness. War, quote from Asquith, "War will dwarf the Ulster and Nationalist volunteers to their true proportions." But despite getting Home Rule in the statute book, it could not stop the decline in Liberals' fortunes. Pass Home Rule quickly, so the government could get on with the many other reforms that they had promised. Several factors preventing this happening. Asquith's "we better wait and see" tactic that he used. He planned to sit in the sidelines, let things develop and intervene at last minute. This meant the government only reacted to events and had handed the initiative to Unionists. No plan in Ulster. Asquith and his cabinet colleagues had no plan to deal with opposition. They did not seriously discuss Ulster despite private doubts among key ministers such as Lloyd George and Churchill. Again, this allowed Unionists to control events. Satisfy IPP allies by introducing Home Rule. Pressure IPP. Asquith preferred to reassure the IPP that he was fighting for an all-Ireland Home Rule solution. He might have tried to be straight with them and encourage compromise in Ulster. Instead, he was naively optimistic that a peaceful deal would be made. Stay in government. Survive the crisis, but civil war, paramilitaries and gun runnings north and south. Asquith called the Larne gun running a grave and unprecedented outrage. Cure a mutiny, remove the threat of the army. Conservatives wanted to wreck Home Rule completely and used the issue to get back into power. Winston Churchill quote, "The Conservatives hate the government and are bitterly determined to defeat it." Partial victory by 1914. Liberals still in power, but in decline. Unite Party. Almost complete success. Tariff reform. Catastrophic split in party over free trade versus protection for industry. Defeated in 3 elections between 1906 and 1910. Conservatives talked of never holding office again. Needed to restore credibility after the battles over the People's Budget and Parliament Act 1911. Anti-Home Rule was the perfect issue that all Conservatives could unite behind. Defeat Home Rule. All Ireland Home Rule was very unlikely by 1914, but this was seen differently within sections of the Conservative Party. Bonar Law's sympathy with Ulster. Father Minister in Coleraine, prepared to fight with and seemed to have genuine sympathy with Ulster Unionists, was happy that some Ulster exclusion was reasonable. Southern Unionists. Lords Lansdowne, Lords Curzon and Walter Long, all senior Conservatives, saw partition as the abandonment of Southern Unionists. Brink of civil war. Bonar Law's aggressive new style in which he was prepared to go any lengths to unite the party to get into power. Bonar Law quote 1912, "I can imagine no lengths that the Ulster people could go that the British public would not support." Some historians, such as Mansur and Rees, are highly critical of his inciting violence and his actions surrounding the annual Army Act, Cure a Mutiny, and attempts to involve the King. The war arguably saved Bonar Law from having to defend a civil war he had done much to bring about. Conservatives back in power. By September 1914, the Liberals were still in power but had been terminally weakened. The Conservatives had strengthened and were on the rise. Rees quote, "The Conservatives had gained politically by supporting the Ulster Unionist resistance." Ulster Unionists wanted to destroy Home Rule completely, but most were happy to settle for some form of Ulster exclusion. Jackson, an Ulster Unionist, wounded by the enactment of Home Rule and the absence of any definite arrangements for the exclusion of Ulster. Craig would have been more satisfied than Carson. Carson, leader of the Ulster Unionists, but with strong sympathies with Southern Unionists, being a native of Dublin. Carson's sole reason for entering politics was the guiding star of maintaining the Union for all of Ireland. He failed to stop Home Rule reaching the statute book. Mobilising Ulster. Carson wrote that he would sacrifice anything if they would not be abandoned by the Ulster people. Ulster was successful in resisting Home Rule, but Bew notes that Carson was embarrassed with the sectarianism of Ulster, the example being the expulsion of Catholic ship workers that came with the mobilisation. Historians debate whether Carson would have sanctioned violence with the UVF. Ulster was a reckoning device. Carson believed initially that if they could make a good case for Ulster, then they could defeat Home Rule completely. The rest of Ireland would be unable to function without Ulster, and therefore, as Carson explained to Southern Unionists, if Ulster succeeds, Home Rule is dead. Quote, for his Southern Unionist friends, partition was the worst case scenario. Carson failed on this. Ulster exclusion. By September 1913, Carson was recommending to Bonar Law a clean cut of 6 Ulster counties outside Home Rule. This showed his pragmatic side. If he could not stop Home Rule, but he could save as much as Ulster as possible. Carson also successfully rejected the notion of temporary execution in March 1914. Ulster wanted no stay of execution for 6 years. Quote from Carson. By September 1914, Carson had almost ensured partition, something he had never set out to do. Craig. From a wealthy Ulster whisky distilling background, he had little affinity with Southern Unionists and was quite comfortable with the drift towards partition. Impress Carson. Craig needed a charismatic front man to lead the Ulster Unionists. At Balmoral, Craig mobilised 100,000 supporters for Carson to speak to. Carson agreed to lead the Ulster Unionists. Ulster not bluffing. Craig used his military experience to great effect, organising peaceful actions like Ulster Day, September 28, 1912, the signing of the Covenant, the structures of the Provisional Government, and more militant actions such as the UVF, January 1913, gun running, April 1914. This raised the stakes and made Ulster resistance appear real and no longer a bluff. Cura Mutiny. This meant that the Liberals could not even threaten to use the army to enforce Home Rule in Ulster. This strengthened the Unionist hands because Ulster would have to agree to any compromise. IPP, Irish Parliamentary Party, had a partial victory by September 1914 as Home Rule was on the statute book, but the nature of the Ulster Amendment and the length of the war were nagging doubts. Jackson on Redmond won a form of triumph. However, anything less than an all-Ireland Home Rule would be a defeat. Ireland as a unit. Redmond denied Ulster's right to partition. He felt that the minority could not stop the majority's democratic right. Quote, Ireland is a unit. The two-nation theory is to us a blasphemy. October 1912. Redmond was to regret this statement because he was to concede the county option for a period of 6 years in March 1914. Rees argues that once Redmond agreed that Ulster could be treated differently, he virtually assured partition. Reconcile Ulster Unionists to Home Rule. Underestimated Ulster resolve. Redmond saw Ulster, in Rees's phrase, as a rock to be blasted out of the way. Dillon and Devlin, MP for West Belfast, surprisingly given his vantage point in the north, agreed that Ulster resistance was bluff. Devlin quote from February 1914, "We do not believe these threats of civil war." The IPP failed to convince Unionists that the Union was safer under Home Rule. Carson quote, "No halfway house between the Union and complete separation." Redmond's belief in negotiation, too willing to compromise. IPP lost credibility because Redmond was seen as lacking a backbone. Jackson quote, "damaged his credibility not only with hardliners." IVF and gun running. Redmond did not like the drift towards extra parliamentary options, although he quickly moved to take control of the IVF. Conclusion. On the face of it, it looked like the Liberals and IPP had successfully guided Home Rule onto the statute book, but with an intermediate war delaying its implementation and promised amendment for Ulster, both parties fell short of reaching their political objectives. In addition, the Liberals had been damaged by the crisis, while the Conservatives had benefited. The latter had recovered their credibility and were a party on the up. The Ulster Unionists could be largely satisfied that they are going to be left out of Home Rule.